There you go. But while DTV is the most immediate media issue facing America, a longer simmering debate over the freedom of expression lurks in the background and may soon jump back into the foreground. I hope my remarks today will help start a rational and thoughtful conversation about a topic that typically produces much hyperventilation among people of all political and ideological stripes: the possible return of the so-called fairness doctrine. The mere mention of its name raises not only blood pressure, but also many questions from all quarters. Is it returning? If so, under what name this time? Would it apply to more media platforms than before? How would it be enforced in practical terms? Would it really serve the public interest? Would the court strike it down? Inquiring minds want to know, or at least talk show hosts want to talk about it. It's hard to tell if current calls for its return will gain traction or not. On the one hand, recently several prominent members of Congress have called for its restoration. Still, others are strongly opposed to its revival. Frequently, when I give interviews about DTV, I'm asked about the fairness doctrine instead. So perhaps this is a perfect time to examine why it was created to begin with, historical abuses of it by both Republicans and Democrats, practical enforcement difficulties, and the legal difficulties its restoration would create. Let's start with how and why this rule was ever engendered to begin with. Let's jump back in time to the era of flappers, speakeasies, the Red Scare, and a controversial new technology, radio. In the 1920s, the FCC's predecessor, the Federal Radio Commission, began to grapple with the problem of too many people trying to broadcast messages at the same time and at different power levels in the then limited space of the radio dial. This spectral free-for-all caused interference that effectively undercut the ability of anyone to be heard. My father would tell us stories about growing up on a ranch along the Tex-Mex border near Del Rio, Texas. And Del Rio's twin city across the Rio Grande in Mexico was Villa Acuña, the home of the infamous Dr. Brinkley and his 1 million watt radio station. Dad said that Dr. Brinkley's signal was so powerful it caused the screen doors and bed springs to act as radio receivers, causing them to talk. And that actually happened. Well, it was similar scenarios that led to the solution of government licensing of frequencies to specific users. And that quickly led to questions about what duties licensees owed to the general public. The idea behind such regulation was that only a finite amount of spectrum existed, and it was a natural resource belonging to the public. Yet, a licensee was allowed to use his or her radio frequency to the exclusion of others. In short, licensees had the power to air their point of view and no one else's. In fact, back then, few stations ever aired regular letters to the editor features, and even fewer were subject to major defamation suits. With only the print media as its competitor and a mere 623 radio stations on air by 1935, this new medium seemed to many to be a powerful political threat. Thus was born the concept of spectrum scarcity, the underpinning of the regulation of speech, including even core First Amendment protected political speech broadcast over the airwaves. As early as 1929, the old Federal Radio Commission decided that it would hear complaints from those denied the right to express their views over a broadcast station. The FRC was concerned that some licensees might be running propaganda stations rather than facilities that provided, quote, ample play for the free and fair competition of opposing views, end quote. Of course, the propaganda of concern back then emanated from budding socialist and communist movements in the U.S. And interestingly, to the FRC, propaganda also included quacks like Dr. Brinkley, who offered false cures for cancer. Perhaps that's why he moved just across the river to Mexico. Furthermore, it is important for proponents of the doctrine's restoration and expansion to understand that they have opponents from across the political spectrum, including prominent liberals. In a recent Wall Street Journal op-ed, John Sipple, the founding president of the liberal Air America radio network, wrote that although he disagrees strongly with conservative talk radio hosts on just about everything, when it comes to the doctrine, he wrote, quote, "I couldn't agree with them more. The fairness doctrine is an anachronistic policy that, with the abundance of choices on radio today, is entirely unnecessary," end quote. In helping to found the left-leaning radio network, Sipple went on to say, "It never occurred to me to argue for reimposing the fairness doctrine. Instead, I sought to capitalize on the other side of a market already built," end quote. Similarly, Marvin Amori, a law professor at the University of Nebraska and counsel to the advocacy group Free Press, recently called the fairness doctrine, quote, "a flawed means to attain a noble goal," end quote, while characterizing the current discussion, at least on talk radio, as a partisan wedge designed to, quote, "detract from more pressing and timely media policy issues." Amori, in a recent Law Review article, took pains to explain that a revived doctrine could be applied to Ed Schultz, Democracy Now!, Pacifica, and Air America, no less than it would to Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, and Michael Savage. He also detailed how difficult the doctrine would be to enforce. Is there not also a generational divide here? Plenty of empirical data, including the Commission's most recent media ownership studies, reveal that the older you are, the more likely it is that you read a daily newspaper and or listen to regularly local broadcast news. Younger Americans simply do not turn to broadcasting and newspapers for their news, information, and commentary. They look to the web. New market data emerging every day confirms that the rise of new media has eroded the mainstream media's old gatekeeping and agenda-setting power when it comes to the dissemination of information and ideas. Just look at the sites in the net roots realm, like the Daily Kos, or, on the other side, the Drudge Report. But older generation people, some of whom are now in charge of policymaking, are still thinking in old world and old media terms. What they don't understand is that the media marketplace has passed them by and that the factual basis for a doctrine restoration does not exist. I am hopeful that our new president may understand this new media paradigm. As I watched his inaugural address last week, I was struck by the relevance of the debate over the doctrine to a section of his speech where he said, "To those who cling to power through corruption and deceit and the silencing of dissent, know that you are on the wrong side of history," end quote. I am encouraged that President Obama can, once and for all, end the speculation of whether something akin to the doctrine will come back to life during his term. During the campaign, a spokesperson for candidate Obama told Broadcasting and Cable that he, quote, "does not support reimposing the fairness doctrine on broadcasters," calling the debate over the doctrine, quote, "a distraction from the conversation we should be having about opening up the airwaves and modern communications to as many diverse viewpoints as possible," end quote. Although that statement is not entirely clear, the new administration has a terrific opportunity now to enunciate its strong opposition to anything resembling the doctrine. I hope that those who either agree or disagree with my observations will do so in a thoughtful and rational way. But even if you do not, I will fight for your First Amendment right to disagree with me unreasonably without unnecessary interference from the government. Thank you for having me here, and I look forward to any questions folks might have.